I want to read the parable, and we'll talk just a moment about it. And then we're going to look at Jesus' explanation of it. I've often thought it's too bad that we didn't have Jesus' own interpretation of every parable he told. This is one of those parables where he gives us point-for-point interpretation. Remember last week I talked about that there's been this sort of tension related to understanding through the years. And that understanding is, well, does a parable of Jesus make one point, or does it make several points? And the answer to that is yes. Sometimes it does both. And what's interesting is sometimes in the parables of Jesus, we're not quite sure what certain things stand for. In this one, though, Jesus gives us the one-for-one correspondence. Here's what this is, and here's what it stands for. And we'll look at how Jesus provides that interpretation for us. Now, last week, as we started in this, we talked about we are moving into another teaching section of Matthew, and we talked a moment about Jesus' teaching methods. Jesus, the master teacher. There's so many ways in which Jesus sought to get his message across, and parables is one of those ways. In Matthew 13, Jesus is going to use parables to get at the essential nature of the kingdom and explore what that means. It is perhaps fascinating to think of how Jesus could use simple, little everyday things to get at deeper spiritual truths. And sometimes we do this. Something will happen, and we'll talk to someone about what's happened, and then we'll say, but I think what that really means at a deeper level is this. And so sometimes we're aware that small, simple events can carry with them much deeper meanings if we take time and reflect on that. And it's in this chapter that the purpose of parables is revealed. And when I was exploring that last week, I talked about Matthew, with the setting of his parables. It's interesting that Matthew is going to emphasize a few things differently from Mark and Luke, and a really rich study, of which we don't have the time to do it here, and I wish that we did, is to look at the set of parables that Mark includes, and then the set that Luke includes, and even the ones that are common. There are some parables that all three gospel writers include, and each one will take a little bit different perspective on the same parable. And it's such a rich study, but that's not the direction we're going right now. This Matthew chapter 13 is the third and central discourse of Matthew's 5 teaching sections. There are 5 large teaching sections in Matthew, and we're in the middle one. And Jesus, and this is interesting, there are situations where in the parables and in his teaching, the crowds at large get to hear Jesus teach. But in many of the parables, it's clear that Jesus is trying to get his disciples to be more receptive to the nature of the kingdom. He's trying to help them see at a deeper level what he's all about. And there are many times they don't get it. And they often say, well, we heard the parable, what does it really mean? And then we have this intervening section that we'll get to on the purpose of the parables. We talked about in the parables, actually in the whole ministry of Jesus and his teaching, there is this dynamic that goes back and forth. And in the history of Christian interpretation related to Jesus' teachings, it seems like it's been a huge controversy. But in the Gospels, this tension is never really resolved. Both things are there. And it's bringing up again the issue of what does it mean for God to be a sovereign God? God is all powerful. God is all knowing. And if that's true, does that take away our freedom of will and freedom to make choice? And so how do you pull those two together? One writer said, we encounter the mysterious sovereignty of God, and this is a neat way of saying this, who accomplishes his will without at any time violating a person's freedom of choice or the responsibility that goes with it. And parables function kind of in the same way. For those who have responded positively to Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom, the parables convey further insight and knowledge. But for those who have rejected Jesus and his message, the parables have the effect of only darkening the subject further. Therefore, belief and commitment lead to further knowledge, while unbelief leads to further ignorance. That last statement is fascinating. Do you realize that your belief and your commitment to Jesus and your putting into action what you know to be true opens you up the rest of your life to further knowledge about the will of God, opens you up for a deeper understanding of God's will in your life, perhaps even deeper awareness of your own spiritual self, and certainly a deeper awareness of God working in the world. So when we believe and we are committed, God blesses that belief and God blesses that commitment by continuing to give us further knowledge. That's amazing. Yeah, Judy?
Belief opens the door.
Yes.
But unbelief closes the door.
Oh, what a great way of saying that. Belief opens the door, but unbelief closes it. That's exactly right. And so the disciple, the Gospel of John really picks up on this. Notice that there are people in the Gospel of John who believe just a little bit. The door gets cracked open just a little bit. And Jesus comes along and says, that's all I'm asking. Just crack the door open a little bit, and I can work with that. But then there are those who are closed, who do not believe, and so they're not receptive. Now, let's look at the parable of the weeds. I want to start reading at verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. And the owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he said. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he said, because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. Whenever I read this parable, and at the point where the servants go to the owner and say, do you want us to pull them up? And he says, no, because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. My mind goes back to an event in my childhood. I'm the oldest of 6 kids, and in order for us to survive and have something to eat, we had a big, big garden patch. And I felt like growing up I was working on a huge farm, harvesting stuff for the rest of the winter and getting ready to have things prepared so we could eat. Well, one year, right about the crucial time, every year we planted rows and rows of potatoes every year. Well, one summer, about the crucial time when we should have been, pulling weeds out of and of course, I never got into trouble as a young child because or a teenager. Anytime it looked like I needed something to do or I was bored, my parents would say, okay, go out and pull weeds. Seems like there was a certain time in my youth where I was pulling weeds. Well, one year, when it was sort of the crucial time, that we were supposed to be pulling weeds out of the potatoes. We had a lot of rain, and then we went on vacation at that time. When we came back, like, wow. And so I thought, well, can we go along and pull all these weeds out of the potatoes? And I remember my mother saying, no, don't pull the weeds out of the potato. It'll just pull the little potatoes out of the ground if you do that. Let's just let the weeds grow with the potatoes. And then whenever it comes time to harvest them, then we can harvest them. And I don't know if maybe it was the kind of weeds that grew up in the potatoes that year or what. But when it came time to harvest the potatoes, we took a couple of lawnmowers and set them up on the wheels as high as we could go and mowed down all the weeds. And then we harvested them, and potatoes rolled out like small watermelons. I'd never seen anything like it. And I had never forgotten that experience, that had we gone along at that early time and just yanked out every single weed that was in the rows, those little potatoes would have rolled out and they wouldn't have grown anymore. So every time I read this, I think about that event in my own life growing up. Now, the reason I'm describing all this is because Jesus is going to give interpretation here in a few minutes. And I want you to see if you can isolate the one core idea that this whole parable revolves around. Because he never does really explicitly say what the issue is that this parable is addressing about the kingdom. But you see it in action. So when we get toward the end, I want to see if you can sort of articulate or put it into words. What is there about the kingdom that this parable is meant to talk about, though he doesn't specifically say it in words? Okay? He starts off telling the parable, the kingdom of heaven is like. And this is a favorite expression of his, to prepare his listeners that he is going to make a comparison. And that's actually what the word parable means. It's a laying down alongside of something very simple, but laying it down alongside of a spiritual principle that you want to really elaborate on. A man sowed good seed in his field. Now let's not go past that phrase too quickly. Notice the emphasis is on the good seed. Okay, so the good seed is sown. The problem isn't the seed when we continue in the parable. I remember one year, what was it? Nancy and I had a little garden, and we were going to plant some special kind of beans that my mother gave me. And we got all excited, and we planted a big long row, and only a couple came up. The seeds were bad. So it makes a difference if you have good seed or bad seed. So a man sowed good seed in his field, okay? An enemy came while he was sleeping. Now, there's been some interesting speculation on this. I was reading different writers on this parable, and you wonder if this part of the parable is meant to say, and of course he's going to talk about the enemy here in a moment, that Satan works when we're unaware. Because notice, he's got his field planted. He's now sleeping, kind of normal activity. And in the normal activity of things, Satan is at work in ways that we're unaware of. And certainly, this owner of the field was unaware that an enemy was going to come and sow some weeds. The first thing here that's fascinating, and Jesus doesn't go into detail. An enemy that intentionally sows these weeds, I think the word is tares. We're going to look at a picture here in a minute that will describe that. But an enemy that intentionally does that, I think there's a huge insight here that Jesus wants to get at, even when he starts with his interpretation here in just a moment. Satan is intentionally active in trying to undermine the people of God. Evil in this world that is truly spiritual evil doesn't just happen by accident. You know what I'm talking about. It does not happen by accident. That's why I think as Christians, somehow we need to remind each other constantly. Satan is active in this world. He is intentional with his evil. And so if we accept that, then I think we're going to be more intentional in our prayer life. We're going to be more intentional in our thought life. We're going to be more intentional in resisting temptation. There's all different ways that help us. When we're aware of that, we're going to become more intentional in our Christian life. We're not trying to live a good life, perceiving that evil is just something that happens accidentally. It's not the way the New Testament presents it. And I think that what is underneath this enemy's activity is Jesus trying to help his disciples, and those of us who are reading it 2,000 years later, to be aware Satan is active in evil and promoting it. Now, the seed appeared, and do you want us to pull him up, is the question. He goes, no, wait for the harvest. Now, here's a picture of the wheat field, and apparently this is the type of weeds. It's called the darnel. Some people call it, but it's a type of grassy weed that mimics and looks a lot like wheat, but when you look at it, you can tell it's not exactly wheat. But you could see if that grows down in among your wheat, if you start going and pulling it up, you're going to start pulling up, especially if you got a lot of it, you're going to start pulling up wheat with it. So just leave it alone until the harvest. And that's the direction given by the owner. Now, let's look at the parable explained. And before we do that, I want to jump down, if you have your Bibles, I want to read verse 52, because there's a wonderful comment here, and when we get down to the parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl and the parable of the net, we'll come back and develop this verse a little bit more strongly. But verse 52, he said to them, therefore every teacher of the law who has been instructed about the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. Now think what Jesus is saying about understanding the parables. If you understand the nature of the kingdom, two things is going to happen at once. You're going to appreciate the old, which I think for Jesus means God's plan as of old. That you will be aware and you'll appreciate more what God has been up to. It's almost like spiritual 20/20 hindsight. You can see what God has been doing. But also, if you're open to seeing what God has been doing, you're now open for new ideas, new treasures of the kingdom, and openness to, remember we talked earlier, deeper understanding. So I find this verse fascinating because it tells us one of the reasons why Jesus is hoping that his audience can get the parables that he's teaching. Well, in the few minutes that we have, let's look at this. Jesus gives his interpretation of the parable because the disciples come to him after he left the crowd. He goes in the house, the disciples come in and say, well, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Now here's what's interesting. Jesus' teaching occurs on two levels. Can you imagine hearing the parable of the sower or the parable here of the wheat and the tares, hearing this parable, and then Jesus walks away and you don't get to hear the explanation of it. So there's a greater crowd hearing the parable, but it's not till he goes into the house and the disciples ask, what does this mean? There's something interesting about this as a model. People who write a lot about discipleship in the Gospel of Matthew will point to this and say that there are teachings of Jesus that individuals who are not part of the kingdom, people who aren't Christians, they can hear things about Jesus, but that's all they hear. And only as a committed disciple do we take, it's as if we go into the house with Jesus and we say, okay, now this is the teaching. As a disciple, explain that to me. I spend time with Jesus and His Spirit and His Word, and I'm open to what the Word and God through His Word wants to teach me. So it's as if I too am a disciple asking Jesus, like these disciples asking, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. So the one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. It's interesting that in all the Gospels, when Jesus uses the expression Son of Man, He refers to Himself. And He's not referred to by the disciples that way, and certainly not His enemies. The field is the world. And the good seed stands for the sons or the children of the kingdom. And the weeds are the sons of the evil one. And the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned up in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out His angels, and they will weed out of His kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear. So Jesus is inviting them to take in His interpretation here. Several things I think are critical. Notice that the good seed stands for the sons of the kingdom. And when you read His interpretation and you back up a minute and say, okay, what is Jesus trying to address here? How would you pull that together in a statement? This parable addresses what issue? It's a significant issue that we struggle with too today. So what is it? How would you like to phrase it? Vicki? What were you saying? Okay, it could be the separation of the church and the world. What else? Do you think about what he's dealing with here? The presence of evil. How can the kingdom of God exist alongside the presence of evil? And is it our place to always get rid of evil? Well, in some instances, we can't. We don't know what Satan is up to often. And the way we handle it is to say, God, this is your kingdom, this is your world, your kingdom's in the world, evil's present in the world. We're going to leave that final judgment to you. And so you say, okay, well, how do Christians live in a world full of evil? The answer is simple. You just go on being a Christian. It's simple. There are things that God's going to do in the end that we can't do. Bill?
Some things you can change, some things you can't change.
Yeah.
In this situation, the evil seed cannot be changed.
Right.
And the judgment is not ours. The judgment is God's.
That's right. That's right. We can be upset with evil. We can stand up against it. But it's not ours to provide the judgment for it, is it? That's God's. It reminds me, and this is a hard thing for us to swallow, Romans 12 talks a little, is a perfect example, case study of this. What do you do when somebody treats you wrongly? Well, you can take vengeance against that person, get revenge. But Paul says in Romans 12, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I'll repay. And the way you get back at your enemy is you just heap coals of fire on their head by doing kindness. Oh, really? Okay. And Jesus says, pray for them. So we don't attack them. We pray for them. We let God do the judgment. And it's a fascinating way to think about how do we live the Christian life in a world where Satan is active. After all, he's trying to accomplish his will. Notice that he says, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. And notice that the devil is trying to bring along individuals to become what you might call sons of the evil one. He wants people to become his children. Now, there's something else that I think is really significant here. Notice in verse 41, the Son of Man will send out his angels. They will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. I think the word evil here, I need to double check. I think it's the same word back in Matthew 7, where we talked about, Jesus portrays sin as unrighteousness. It's a lawlessness. It's the idea that we're going to live any way that we want to. Yeah, Bill?
Necessarily addressed that is here, but comes from the example of sowing and reaping and having this darnel or weeds that are there. Only those that are the closest to that weed are the most effective. It robs nutrients from the soil and it gets the moisture from the soil.
Yeah, that's right. Boy, you could you can go with that principle, can't you? And so what you have to be aware of is, well, let me. I came across something, and I was toying with whether or not to. This is such a good summary. I just want to share it with you. And it's from a little book on the parables, and it's called Stories That Astonish. And listen to how this reader summarizes this. And he goes, without question, the work of Satan intrudes into the work of the kingdom. He uses several strategies designed to slow down or kill the growth of God's kingdom. Now, this author lists the following strategies of Satan, and I'll share these with you, but I know that you could add to this. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. The traditional 7 deadly sins, if you're familiar with those. Apathy or division or malicious evil, a fault-finding spirit, a spiritual inferiority complex. He says, no doubt Satan has planted his own people in God's field. But notice this, human efforts to purify the church always fail. From the Donatists from the 4th century, who tried to purify the church of heresy, to modern zealots, damage is always done to the church. God never commends irresponsible zeal, and neither does God commend impatience. God never commends those who try to take over his place. He has no compliments for those who try to appear holier than God is. God is the gardener, not man nor any group of men. We must allow God to be God. He will purify his own kingdom in his own time and in his own way. I like the way that sounds, because that means we believe God in his own way is going to accomplish his will in the world, though at times it looks like Satan is winning with all the evil that he's accomplishing. But this is an amazing parable because it gets at the nature of the kingdom in the sense that it is opposed to evil, but while the kingdom is existing here on earth, there will be the presence of evil around it. And so we cannot use the excuse that there's so much evil in the world that we can't do anything. You and I are responsible for the world in which we live. We're responsible for resisting Satan and his evil schemes within the world in which we revolve. Now, we may not be able to do anything in other parts of the world, but we're responsible for right here. How do I portray Jesus? How do I exemplify life in the kingdom? What does it look like in my own heart and life when I try to be a disciple of Christ? And that's my primary calling. Okay.
When we look back and we take insight to what happened to Job, I think we get a good insight on what he's talking about here.
Yeah.
He allowed Satan to do everything to Job except take his life.
Yeah.
But Job remained faithful, which tells us that we have to let God handle the situation, but we have to put faith in him that he's going to do it.
And
I think another thing with this is, too, I think one of the most ways that Satan uses things in this life is to try to separate us. First of all, he tries to separate us from the Lord.
yeah.
Then he tries to separate us from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. That's sort of his strategy, isn't it?
It is.
It is. There's another thing with the Job story. Throw this in with some of the comments you made, David. We don't get from the story that God ever told Job, and Job doesn't know why all these things happened to him to start with. Apparently, he's never told. Now, I've often said this. I hope God isn't saying to Satan, have you considered my servant Curtis? I'm like, no. Don't do that. I don't want to go through what Job went through. But it's interesting that in the story, we don't ever get the idea that God pulls the curtain aside for Job to see that initial discussion between God and Satan. He never has the privilege of knowing that. So that he's going through all of these difficult things, and they're really difficult. And yet, he still remains true to God. That's a good example. Oh, our time is over. So the parable of the weeds and the tares, no matter how it looks like Satan is active in the world, we just go on faithfully being God's people. Knowing, and this is what gives us motivation and encouragement and endurance, knowing that the Son of Man will send his angels in the end to harvest. And this harvest message, and we're going to see this in different forms all through Matthew, this harvest message for the future is one of encouragement for God's people. It's always been that way. A word of encouragement to endure because the harvest is coming. Just as the owner of the field looks forward to the harvest, we who are disciples, we look forward to that harvest. We'll pick up there next week. Thank you all for being here.